Well, hello everyone. It is Jordan Goldmeyer. I'm here to show you my interactive periodic table of elements. Now, what's so special about this is it uses a method called the rollover method, which I actually discovered and developed around 2014. It exploits a bug in Excel. I've written about it extensively in Dashboards for Excel. I talk about how to use it in my course. I'm going to show you quickly how it works here. Now, this is an advanced technique, so if you don't quite follow along, you might want to go Google or YouTube the rollover method so you can figure out how it works. But the basics of it is when you roll over a cell, a user-defined function is called. That user-defined function actually changes the value of another cell. Now, advanced developers will know that this is technically not allowed in Excel, but because we're exploiting a bug, we are able to use it. So I'm going to briefly show you how I made this. And again, this does use the rollover method to work. Now, what you see here is the periodic table of elements, and that's being presented. Over here, I can highlight over these, and that's going to highlight specific parts of the elements on the chart. Now, all the data here is organized. If I click on data over here, it's organized within a table. The table is called dataset, and I pull all my information from there. In addition, I also have some named ranges here. We have a current index that's actually going to give me, the current index is actually the ID, the record ID in, I guess, the chemical ID of an element, right? So that current index is going to tell us that. I also bring back other information that's related to that. Even though I don't report it all here, I do have it in case you want to use it. Now, let's get to the bread and butter of how this works. There's really two, what I would say, hotspot hover fields. If you've seen me talk about rollovers, you know about hotspots and hover fields. But if not, let me just give it to you straight, okay? What we have here is we have all the data as being presented. But if I scroll down here, you can see that I have my layout of my periodic table, and each one of these numbers here is the ID of that element. The idea is when I hover over this, okay, it's going to call the rollover element user-defined function, that's this right here, and it's going to pull in, we can see C18, that's this right here. So each one of these is going to pull in its own ID, and then once we have that ID, we can actually use that. Let's see here, I was on ID 22, we can use that to look up the related information from the table. Well, how does that work? Okay, well, let's break down this initial formula here. So we have the C18, that's going to pull back the ID. That's just this, what's being reported. So if I hit escape here, that's the 1. Then I have this char 10. What does that do? Well, that's just a new line. Okay, so far the data that we're looking at is just a new line. Okay, so then what about this next part right here? What about this next part right here? So what you see here is we use an index and we're pulling the symbol. All right, so we're pulling the symbol from that data set. So that's what we're pulling. And of course, that's going to be given to us by C18. But now we have this thing in here that says if error hyperlink rollover element. So what is that? Well, that is the basis. That is the basis of our hyperlink, or of our rollover function, right? You see it says at rollover element. So how does that work? Well, here's what I have. I'm going to bring over my VBA window and I'll go to module 1 because of course, when we use rollover elements, they have to be in the modules, right? So I have this thing in here called public function rollover element, and you'll note here that that is the same as this here. So whenever you put a user-defined function inside a hyperlink, it will be called when your mouse rolls over that cell. And to make it even better, you can put on wrap text, and that will make sure that it's just not just rolling over the text of the cell, but any part of the cell you roll over. It's going to call this rollover element right here. Now, what this does is it's going to fire the macro that is very important to us. Now, you may think the macro is actually highlighting the cell and turning it red, but no, all the macro does, and let me just show this to you here, all the macro does is write whatever cell we are on. In that case, the index is 1, right? It's going to write that 1 to the current index named range. So that current index named range is right here. So let me just show that to you. I'll put my mouse over this 1 and then I'll try not to roll over anything else. You can see that's a 1 right here. Well, this is where it gets really kind of interesting here. Now, how do I get this red thing? Well, what I do is I highlight this whole thing here. I go to Home, go to Conditional Formatting, go to Manage Rules, all right? And if I scroll down, you'll see this set of rules that I've written. And, you know, it's kind of like all over the place a little bit, which is what happens. Perhaps in the final file, I will fix that. That just kind of happens when you drag everything everywhere. But the basics of it work like this, okay? So if I hit Edit Rule here, we're gonna test if the current index equals C18. So let's scroll down, we see C18 here. Note, however, that C18 is not locked in, okay? So I'm gonna move my face over here. C18 is not an absolute reference. Well, what does that mean? It means as we move along the conditional formula, when we start testing, you know, for C5 right here, that's gonna test not against C18, but rather C19. So what we're gonna do is note we have all the indices here, so we're just testing whether the current index matches one of these indices, and when it does, we will apply the format to the cell that looks like this border here. And that's it, right? We could also add a fill. I didn't add one, but I'm just gonna show this to you. If I hit OK here, like that, this will add a fill color to it. Okay, so you can see here that I've set the format, and it works, right? We can see that this is greenish here, and I changed it. Although I don't like the way that looks. I did like it how it looked before, so I'll go to Format here, and then I'm gonna click on Edit Rule, and we'll go to Format, Fill, No Color. Okay, so that's the basics of that. Anything I wanna highlight functions the same way. So how do these ones work over here? Well, let's take a look. Over in X over here, I'm gonna make these black. I have a true and a false. Every time I highlight over this, one of these values goes to true and the rest go to false. And all this does is, as I highlight over this here, I have a toggle index. Let me just show this to you over here. So these are all 1 through 11. I highlight this over here. You can see I have a hyperlink toggle filter. And of course, we always surround it. It goes hyperlink, UDF, and then you surround it with if error, because if you don't, it's going to come back with an error, because technically using a user-defined function change a value on the spreadsheet is not allowed. So what we'll do is, let me pop open the Visual Basic editor here. So we can see toggle filter, it's the same idea. There's a toggle index range, and we're gonna set it. And you may be wondering, well, what is this like? Why are we testing if it's the same value between both of these? So you can see if it doesn't already equal the index that's being passed in, then set it. Well, because this rollover will fire when your mouse is over it, it will constantly set it to the same value. So I like to test if it already equals that value before I set it, and that way it becomes very fast, right? Because it will only set it once. If I highlight over this, it won't keep resetting it. All right, so we see that these are set. So where does this get set up? Well, if I scroll all the way down here, this over here is going to keep track of the groups that we're using, right? So I have a group here. The unknown group is this one right here. So this tells me this is going to go through and it's going to highlight it, all of these here with the ID, and you can take a look at how it does this, with the ID of the unknown group in that case. If I put my mouse over alkali metals, and I'll make sure not to roll over anything else, we can see it highlights it with the ID of that specified value, right? So that's an ID of 1 over there. Let me see if I can move this. I'll just try to move over a little bit. It's just the loom thing is in my way, so let me just move that out a little bit. Okay, so you see that these all have 1s on them, right? So and so forth. If I move this to 2 over here, these will all have 2s in that grouping area. Now, this is set up basically automatically. Like I said, all this is doing is pulling the data from the data table and then just laying it out where it's supposed to go. Nothing too special about that. So all I do here is if I highlight this whole thing and I go to Home, Manage Conditional Formats, right? You can see that if formula equals C11, so that's the unknown one, we use the unknown color. If it equals C10, that's noble gases, in which case we will use the purple color. So all this does is it'll look at, you can see it says C30 equals 9. Let's find C30. That is this right here. So it's going to go across this entire data set and look for where it equals that number. And that's basically it. It's not a lot of code. A lot of it is driven by formulas. But what you can see is when you use the rollover method, you can make things incredibly fast. Well, if you like this content here, make sure to check out my class at advancedexcel.com, because we take this and we build an additional dashboard using many of the same concepts here. So if you can kind of understand this, you can actually build the, I break it down in the course step by step. Here's where we build this part here. Here's where we build that part. So once you get into the habit of building all the parts, you can actually put this stuff together really, really quickly. But to know that, you actually have to know advanced Excel development. So many developers think, oh, I'm an intermediate, I'm good enough. What could someone teach me that's new? Well, there's a lot of new stuff in Excel, and this is actually kind of an old thing. And there's a lot of older stuff that people don't really know how to do. So if you keep an open mind, you stay creative, you can actually take Excel to the next level, and that's what really separates the intermediate folks from the experts.